There comes a moment in every soul's life when the world you once knew begins to crack, not loudly, not violently, but with a quiet fracture so deep it splits you from the inside. It begins as a feeling, a subtle wrongness, a sense that something is no longer aligned. You wake up one morning and your life still looks the same, but somehow it no longer fits. This is the moment no one warns you about, the moment when spiritual awakening doesn't feel like light, but like loss, not liberation, but collapse. Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." And what he meant is this: truth does not arrive gently. It does not knock on your door with flowers. It tears the wallpaper off your illusions. It rips the mask from your face. It drags you into the basement of your own soul and forces you to see what you've spent an entire lifetime trying not to feel. Most people think awakening is a sunrise, but for those who experience it, it's a storm that shakes everything you thought was real. Because before awakening sets you free, it destroys you. It destroys every story you inherited, every identity you clung to, every dream that was never truly yours. It breaks the version of you that was built for survival, so the version of you born for truth can finally breathe. And here's the part almost no one survives: the silence that follows. Not the peaceful silence of meditation, but the screaming silence of realizing that the person you've been is not the person you truly are, that the life you built was constructed on borrowed meaning, that the path you walked was paved by a self that no longer exists. This is the death Jung spoke of, the ego death, the psychological death that feels like madness, exile, disorientation, grief, a falling inward with no guarantee of who you'll become on the other side. Most people turn back here. They numb. They retreat into their old identity. They slip back into the dream. But you wouldn't be here if you weren't already feeling the cracks. If some ancient part of you wasn't already awakening, a wild, sacred intelligence that refuses to let you sleepwalk through your life any longer. So breathe, because what you are about to hear isn't a fairy tale about enlightenment. It is the real map Jung left behind, the journey through shadow, through silence, through loss, through rebirth. The journey only a few souls ever complete. Welcome to the truth behind spiritual awakening. Not the light, but the fire. There is a specific moment in the human journey when the soul whispers a truth so uncomfortable that the entire structure of your life begins to tremble. It doesn't happen with thunder. It doesn't happen in public. It doesn't even happen all at once. It begins quietly, so quietly that most people ignore it. A subtle emptiness, a strange heaviness, a sense that nothing truly touches you the way it used to. This is the first crack. It's the moment when the life you've been living starts to feel like an echo of itself. The conversations that once engaged you now feel hollow. The goals you fought for feel strangely pointless. The people you resonated with begin to feel distant, as if they're speaking a language your soul no longer understands. You try to shake it off, distract yourself, return to normal. But normal doesn't fit anymore. It's as if your spirit has outgrown the shell of your old identity, and the shell is starting to break. Carl Jung called this the splitting of the persona, the moment when the mask you've worn for years begins to loosen. At first, you resist. You tighten the mask. You try to be who you were. You tell yourself you're tired, or stressed, or unmotivated. You try to force yourself back into routines that once made sense. But there is something ancient inside you, something intuitive, something wild pushing from within. It's not trying to destroy your life. It's trying to free it. But freedom, in the beginning, feels like chaos. Because when the shattering begins, your mind desperately tries to hold the old world together. You cling to familiar identities. You cling to the people who validated the old you. You cling to accomplishments, labels, patterns. But something deeper is happening beneath the surface, something irreversible. The shattering is not an event. It is a realization. The realization that the person you've been is too small for the truth you're becoming, and it terrifies you. Jung wrote that the greatest fear of the human psyche is meeting itself. Not the self you show to the world, the self beneath, the hidden one, the one carrying your unmet grief, your suppressed anger, your authentic dreams, your soul's purpose, the one you've tried to silence because the world taught you to be practical, normal, acceptable. The shattering is the moment that self wakes up. This awakening often feels like a psychological earthquake. Old desires fall away. Old motivations collapse. Old dreams crumble into dust. You begin to see through the illusions you once worshipped. Status, approval, perfection, busyness, productivity. Suddenly, they feel meaningless. You look in the mirror and realize you don't recognize the person staring back. Not because you failed, but because you've changed. You're not disappearing, you're dissolving. And dissolving is the first step toward truth. But here is the part most people don't understand. The shattering isn't the breaking of your life. It's the breaking of the lie you lived inside. It's the moment you realize you've been living from the outside in, trying to be who the world needs, instead of who your soul is. Trying to maintain the identity that kept you safe, instead of the identity that makes you real. And this is where spiritual awakening truly begins. Not with meditation, or crystals, or visions, but with honesty. The honesty to admit that something is wrong. The honesty to stop pretending. The honesty to acknowledge that the life you built was a survival strategy, beautiful, functional, necessary, but not true. This honesty is painful. It feels like betrayal. It feels like a breakdown. It feels like the end. But Jung would tell you, it is the beginning of the beginning. Because when the persona cracks, light enters. Not comforting light, but exposing light. Light that reveals the shadow. Light that shows you everything you've avoided. Light that strips your illusions down to bone. And when you stand in that light, trembling but awake, something profound happens. You realize you can no longer return to who you were. Not because you don't want to, but because that version of you doesn't exist anymore. The shattering is the point of no return. It is the doorway, the rupture, the invitation. It is the soul whispering, there is more. But to reach it, you must let this part of you die. Oh, and that is where the true descent begins. If the shattering is the first crack, then ego death is the moment the entire structure collapses. It doesn't happen because you choose it. It happens because the truth you saw in the shattering cannot be unseen. Your old identity begins to dissolve. Not gently, not gracefully, but in a way that feels like your entire inner world is turning to ash. Ego death is not the death of your physical body. It is the death of the identity you thought was you. Every belief you clung to, every role you performed, every mask you perfected to earn love or belonging, suddenly feels foreign, uncomfortable, hollow. You try to speak the way you used to, but the words don't land the same. You try to return to the dreams that once fueled you, but the fire is gone. You try to feel excitement, but your soul is too honest now. The ego begins to panic. It tells you you're losing control. It tells you you're going crazy. It tells you nothing matters anymore. It tells you that you're falling apart. And in a way, you are. Because ego death is the unraveling of the false self. Carl Jung described this moment as a psychic dismemberment, a psychological dismantling of the persona you spent your life constructing. And the terrifying part is that there is no stable ground to hold on to. Everything feels uncertain. Everything feels unstable. Even your own thoughts become strangers. You're not depressed. You're not broken. You're not malfunctioning. You're shedding. The ego's job has always been control. Control what people think of you. Control how you appear. Control your story, your emotions, your vulnerabilities. The ego is a survival mechanism built in childhood, shaped by trauma, culture, family, and fear. But awakening is not about survival. Awakening is about truth, and truth demands surrender. This surrender is the part that feels like death, because the ego fights back. It clings to your old identity. It clings to familiar pain. It clings to the version of you that was predictable, even if that version was miserable. The ego does not fear suffering. It fears change. It fears the unknown. It fears losing power. It fears becoming irrelevant. So as you descend deeper into your awakening, the ego tries every strategy to pull you back. It floods you with intrusive thoughts. It amplifies your fears. It resurfaces old addictions. It triggers emotional storms that convince you you're regressing. But you're not regressing. You're unraveling, and unraveling is necessary. Because the identity you built was never the fullness of who you are. It was the armor you wore to survive a world that didn't know how to hold your depth. Ego death strips the armor. It leaves you naked with your truth. Raw, exposed, defenseless. This is why it feels like madness. Why you wake up at 3 a.m. with your heart racing. Why you cry for reasons you cannot explain. Why silence becomes unbearable. why you feel like you're floating outside your own life, watching it from a distance. The ego interprets all of this as danger, but your soul knows better, because beneath the chaos, there is a strange clarity, a quiet voice rising from the depths, a knowing that what's collapsing was never truly you, a sense that something sacred is awakening underneath the rubble. Ego death is the dark night of the psyche, the descent Jung described as the night sea journey, where the familiar disappears and the unknown becomes the only compass. Most people turn back here. They run to distractions. They chase noise. They cling to relationships that reflect their old identity. They drown the calling with busy work, with routine, with numbing, because ego death requires the one thing the ego cannot tolerate: letting go. Letting go of who you thought you were. Letting go of what you thought you wanted. Letting go of the life that made sense. Letting go of the illusion of control. Ego death forces you to face the truth, that you never had control. You only had coping strategies, and coping is not living. The true self, the self beneath the persona, beneath the conditioning, beneath the narratives, has been waiting for this moment, waiting for the false structures to crumble, waiting for the noise to quiet, waiting for the ego to collapse under the weight of its own exhaustion. In ego death, something extraordinary happens. You stop identifying with your thoughts. You stop believing every emotion. You stop needing to perform. You stop clinging to the past. You stop chasing the future. You realize that the you've been holding on to was never real. It was a costume, a survival adaptation, a mask that became a prison, and in the silence after the collapse, you hear something new, a subtle whisper from the depths of your being. I am still here. Not the ego, not the persona, not the identity built from fear, but the soul, the one that cannot die. Ego death feels like the end, but it is the initiation, the threshold, the passageway into the next stage, the exile, where you realize you are no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. Ego death leaves you standing at the edge of a world you no longer belong to. But what follows is even more disorienting. The exile. This is the phase almost no one prepares you for. Not religion, not spirituality, not self-help books, not society. Because exile doesn't look dramatic from the outside. You still go to work. You still speak to people. You still smile when required. Nothing big seems wrong, except everything inside you. It begins with a strange sense of distance. You're physically present, but emotionally elsewhere. It's as if someone turned the volume of life down. Food tastes the same, but you don't feel nourished. Music plays, but doesn't touch you. Conversations happen around you, but you feel like a ghost drifting through a world that used to feel familiar. The old version of you is gone. The new version of you hasn't arrived, and so you live in between. This is exile, not punishment, but transition. Carl Jung described this as the moment when the psyche withdraws its energy from old attachments, not because you no longer care, but because something inside you knows those attachments were built on an identity that no longer exists. And that truth is lonely. You begin to sense that you no longer fit into the spaces you used to squeeze yourself into. Family dynamics feel different. Friendships feel outdated. Romantic connections feel misaligned. Even your ambitions feel like relics of a past life. But the most painful part of exile isn't losing others. It's losing access to your old self. The self who knew what to want. The self who had clear goals. The self who felt comfortable in familiarity. The self who could distract itself from pain. The self who believed in the old narrative. That self is gone. And now you're walking through your own life as if it belongs to someone else. This is why so many people turn back. The exile feels like death without a body. You grieve a version of yourself that was never fully real, yet was all you knew. Jung called this the abandonment of the persona. When the psyche refuses to participate in roles that once felt natural, you may still play them, but your soul is no longer in it. You feel disconnected from your own performance. You watch yourself pretend and something inside you aches at the dishonesty. It's not that you want to isolate, it's that the world feels too loud, too superficial, too far from the truth you just encountered. People ask, "Are you okay?" But how do you explain that you're not sad, but dissolving? Not lost, but shedding? Not broken, but awakening? Exile is the phase where you learn how to be alone without feeling abandoned, where silence becomes both unbearable and necessary, where you feel too empty to participate, but too awake to go back to sleep. This liminal state, the space between selves, is sacred. But it feels like exile because the psyche has not yet formed a new center. Your old orientation is gone. Your inner compass is recalibrating. Your soul is taking back authority from the ego. This shift is subtle but massive. You begin to notice the patterns you used to overlook, the manipulations you once tolerated, the conversations that drain you, the roles you played to keep peace, the expectations that suffocated your essence. All of it becomes clearer, painfully clearer, and clarity isolates you. Because when you see truth, you also see what cannot continue. You can't pretend anymore. You can't force resonance where there is none. You can't fit into spaces that shrink your soul. This is where many people think they've fallen off the path, but in reality, they've stepped onto it. Exile isn't a detour. It is the road. It is the soul pulling you away from everything that would keep you small. It is the dismantling of every identity built for approval rather than authenticity. It is the preparation for the deeper descent, the cocoon. Because before you can transform, you must be removed from the environments that reinforce your old self. You must walk alone long enough to hear your own truth. You must lose enough to be ready for what's real. You must experience silence long enough for the soul to speak. The exile asks you one question: will you choose comfort or will you choose truth? And the moment you choose truth, even trembling, even afraid, even uncertain, the cocoon begins to form around you, not to confine you, but to transform you. Exile is not abandonment. Exile is invitation. The invitation to step outside the life that numbed you and step into the darkness that will remake you. And from this darkness, you will enter the next stage. Exile leads you into a silence so vast that, at first, it feels like punishment. But soon you realize it is not a prison. It is a cocoon. Unlike exile, where you feel separated from the world, the cocoon is where the world falls away completely. It's not something you choose. It's something that happens when the psyche pulls all its energy inward to reconstruct itself. Suddenly, you no longer have the capacity for meaningless conversations. You can't tolerate noise. Your social battery collapses. Your soul chooses solitude, not as avoidance, but as necessity. This is the sacred isolation. You're not hiding. You're dissolving. You're disassembling the scaffolding of your old self, piece by piece, belief by belief, illusion by illusion. Carl Jung described this phase as the introversion of psychic energy, a withdrawal from the outer world so the inner world can speak. And when the inner world speaks, it doesn't whisper, it roars. Inside the cocoon, everything you suppressed rises to the surface. Old memories, forgotten wounds, fears you buried under years of distraction, dreams you denied because they didn't fit the identity you performed, emotions you numbed because they were inconvenient. The cocoon forces you to sit with all of it. No escape, no personas, no distractions. Just you and every part of yourself you've ever abandoned. This is why it feels overwhelming. This is why it feels like too much. This is why many people confuse the cocoon with regression. But the truth is the opposite. You're not falling apart. You're being stripped bare for the first time. Spiritual traditions romanticize transformation, but Jung never did. He warned that real awakening requires descending into the depths of the psyche, into the darkness, not away from it. And in the cocoon, the darkness is intimate. It wraps around you. It presses into you. It confronts you with every unresolved conflict, every unspoken truth, every distortion you inherited. You begin to see your patterns clearly. Why you people pleased. Why you tolerated disrespect. Why you chose partners who mirrored your wounds. Why you dimmed your light to protect fragile egos. Why you lived for approval instead of authenticity. The cocoon doesn't destroy your old life. It reveals why that life was never aligned. But this revelation comes with a cost. You lose the ability to lie to yourself. And this loss is both liberating and terrifying. Because once you see, you cannot unsee. Once you awaken, you cannot go back to sleep. Once the soul takes over, the ego cannot regain the throne. Inside the cocoon, time feels different. Some days feel eternal. Some days feel suspended. You feel both empty and full, both lonely and deeply held, both lost and strangely guided. This paradox is the mark of transformation. You are not who you were yesterday, and you will not be who you are tomorrow. You exist in a state of becoming, a sacred in-between space where the old identity has dissolved and the new one has not yet formed. This is why you feel so vulnerable, so rough, so sensitive, so open. But that openness is power. It allows truth to seep in. It allows intuition to strengthen. It allows your soul to begin rewriting the script of your life. The cocoon teaches you how to be with yourself without roles, without personas, without performance. And in this intimate encounter with your inner world, you discover something profound. You were never truly alone. You were only disconnected from yourself. The cocoon reconnects you, not to society, not to validation, but to essence, to instinct, to your original frequency, the one buried beneath conditioning. Many people fear this stage because it feels like life is pausing. But nothing is pausing. Everything is transforming. The butterfly is not resting inside the cocoon. It is dissolving into liquid, becoming unrecognizable, reconstructing itself from a deeper code. You are doing the same. You're dissolving, you're reordering, you're rebuilding, you're remembering. And as this internal metamorphosis accelerates, another force begins to rise from the deep. The shadow, not as a monster, but as a messenger, not as the enemy, but as the part of you that has been waiting to be integrated, and that leads you directly into the next stage. Inside the cocoon, when the world becomes silent and the old self has dissolved, something begins to stir in the dark. Not the ego, not the persona, not the conditioned identity you perform to survive, but the shadow. This is the moment most people fear the most, because the shadow is everything you were taught to hide, everything you were told was too much, too emotional, too intense, too selfish, too angry, everything you rejected in yourself just to be loved. Carl Jung wrote, "The shadow is 90% pure gold, but before it becomes gold, it arrives as truth raw, unfiltered, uncomfortable truth, and truth rarely arrives gently. The shadow does not knock. It breaks down the door. It shows up in the triggers you've ignored, in the jealousy you deny, in the anger you suppress, in the sadness you hide behind achievement, in the patterns that sabotage your relationships, in the loneliness that follows you even in a crowded room, in the numbness that creeps in when life becomes too honest. The shadow speaks in pain, because pain is the language you were forced to silence. Most people run when the shadow appears. They distract themselves. They escape into work. They chase pleasure. They cling to toxic relationships. They drown themselves in spiritual bypassing, affirmations, positivity, escapist enlightenment. But the shadow cannot be bypassed. It waits. It watches. It rises again and again until you turn toward it. Inside the cocoon, you no longer have the strength to run. Your distractions don't work anymore. Your old numbing strategies collapse. Your ego is too weak to hide behind its usual defenses. So for the first time in your life, you face the shadow, not from a place of fear, but from a place of necessity. You begin to see the shadow not as a monster, but as a mirror reflecting the parts of you that were exiled long before you entered the spiritual exile itself. The shadow shows you the anger you were never allowed to express, the grief you never gave yourself permission to feel, the boundaries you never learned to set, the needs you denied for the approval of others, the dreams you abandoned to stay practical, the truth you swallowed to keep the peace. And beneath all of that, the pain of a self you deserted decades ago, just to be accepted. Shadow work is not about fighting darkness. It is about remembering the parts of you that the world taught you to fear. When you look at your shadow long enough, you begin to realize it wasn't your darkness that hurt you. It was your abandonment of it. Everything you reject becomes distorted. Every unclaimed part of you becomes a wound. Every suppressed emotion becomes a trigger. Every hidden truth becomes a pattern. Integration begins when you stop asking the shadow to go away, and instead ask it what it has been trying to protect. You realize the shadow is not the enemy. It is the guardian of your authenticity, the keeper of your power, the archivist of your desires, the protector of your inner child, the voice that says, no more pretending, no more shrinking, no more abandoning yourself. When you finally sit with the shadow, something shifts. Your triggers reveal the truth you avoided. Your anger shows you where your boundaries were violated. Your jealousy shows you what you deeply desire. Your sadness shows you where you disconnected from your heart. Your fear shows you where you are being called to grow. The shadow speaks in metaphors, but its message is always the same. I am the part of you you forced into darkness because the world told you it was unacceptable. I am not here to destroy you. I am here to return you to yourself. This is the beginning of integration, not healing the shadow, but befriending it, not erasing the shadow, but listening to it, not conquering the shadow, but inviting it home. And in this reunion with your rejected self, you begin to reclaim a power you didn't know you lost, the power to be whole. But wholeness comes with a price. It requires descending even deeper into the unknown. It requires dismantling every identity that was built to avoid the shadow. It requires stepping into a space where nothing is familiar, nothing is stable, and nothing can be predicted. This space is terrifying. It is empty. It is silent. It is vast. This space is the void, the next stage of awakening, where you are asked to let go of everything, even the idea of who you are becoming. There comes a point in every spiritual awakening when even the shadow quiets, not because it has disappeared, but because you have finally stopped running from it, because you have turned toward it, listened to it, and offered it something it has never received, your presence. And once the shadow is seen, felt, and acknowledged, the psyche moves into the next stage, the stage most people fear more than pain, more than darkness, more than truth, the void. Unlike the chaos of ego death, unlike the loneliness of exile, unlike the confrontation of the shadow, the void is something else entirely. It is emptiness, pure, fast, unshaped emptiness. Nothing feels like it belongs to you anymore. Your old identity is gone. Your old desires no longer make sense. Your old motivations feel artificial. Your old relationships feel distant. Your old dreams feel irrelevant. You wake up in the morning and feel nothing. Not despair, not joy, just the kind of silence that used to terrify you and now simply confuses you. This is the psychological winter Jung alluded to, a time when the soul retreats into the depths to regenerate, but the surface-level self interprets it as loss. The void is not darkness. Darkness has texture. Darkness has shape. Darkness has mystery. The void is absence. Absence of identity. Absence of direction. Absence of meaning. It is the moment you whisper to yourself, I don't know who I am anymore. Not with fear, but with resignation, with surrender, with a strange, quiet acceptance. Because deep down, you sense something profound. The self you're becoming does not exist yet. You cannot rush it. You cannot force it. You cannot blueprint it. You can only wait. The void is the most sacred part of awakening and the most unbearable, because there is no map, no instructions, no assurance. Your old coping mechanisms won't work here. Your old affirmations won't reach you. Your old patterns have dissolved. Your mind cannot control anything. The ego panics. It says, you're losing yourself. You're falling behind. You're wasting time. You're disappearing. You're failing. But the soul whispers, be still. Let go. Trust. Because the void is not the end. It is the womb. In every myth, every ancient text, every mystical tradition, rebirth begins in nothingness. The seed dissolves into darkness before it sprouts. The caterpillar liquefies completely before becoming the butterfly. Even the universe, Jung noted, began from emptiness. The void is where your old identity dies, and where your new one is conceived. But before rebirth comes a deeper surrender. You must release the need to know. The void asks you to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty, to stop searching for clarity, to stop demanding answers, to stop trying to fix the uncomfortable silence inside you. It asks you to become intimate with stillness, the stillness you spent your whole life avoiding. And in that stillness, something astonishing happens. You begin to hear yourself, not the mind, not the ego, not the conditioned voice of fear, but the deeper self, the self that existed before you was shaped by the world. This self does not speak loudly. It does not demand. It does not rush. It does not chase. It simply waits for you to finally stop, so it can rise. In the void, you learn the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the absence of others. Solitude is the presence of yourself. In the void, you discover the difference between emptiness and openness. Emptiness is lack. Openness is potential. In the void, you realize that the silence you fear is the doorway to everything you've ever sought. People often ask, how long does the void last? But time doesn't exist here. Days feel like months. Months feel like moments. The process isn't linear. The you that keeps track of time no longer exists. You emerge only when the psyche is ready, when enough has dissolved, when enough has been surrendered. when enough truth has been allowed to surface. And the first sign that the void is ending is subtle, a faint pull inward, a quiet spark, a gentle sense that something is returning. Not your old identity, but something deeper, something truer, something unshakable. That spark is the beginning of rebirth, the next stage of awakening, where the new self starts forming from everything you uncovered, everything you integrated, everything you courageously faced. The void is not where you lose yourself. It is where you meet the self that cannot be lost. Rebirth doesn't begin with fireworks. It doesn't arrive with certainty. It doesn't declare itself the way the ego used to, loud, polished, confident. Rebirth begins quietly, so quietly that most people overlook it. It begins with the smallest shift, a breath that feels a little deeper, a morning that feels a little lighter, a moment of clarity that feels strangely grounded. After months, sometimes years of dissolving, shedding, grieving, unraveling, you feel something you haven't felt in a long time, a pulse, not external motivation, not forced positivity, not an attempt to rebuild your old life, but an inner movement, as if your soul is slowly stretching after a long, cosmic sleep. Rebirth is subtle because it happens from the inside out. You don't decide to be reborn. It happens the moment your psyche has emptied enough space for something new to enter. Carl Jung described this as the emergence of the self, the deeper center of consciousness that has been waiting beneath all your conditioning. It is not the personality you crafted. It is not the role you performed. It is not the mask you wore. It is the essence that existed before the world taught you who to be. Rebirth feels like coming home to a self you forgot you were. You begin noticing things differently. Colors feel richer. Silence feels nourishing. Your body feels more rooted. Your intuition becomes louder. You respond instead of react. You speak more truth, but with less aggression. You feel more deeply, but with less fear. You don't become perfect. You become honest, and honesty changes everything. You look at your past with compassion rather than shame. You see your wounds not as curses, but as teachers. You see the people who hurt you not as villains, but as mirrors. You no longer chase validation, because you finally understand that nothing external can add or subtract from your worth. Rebirth is not about improving yourself. It is about remembering yourself. Remembering the truth beneath all the noise. Remembering the child who felt deeply. Remembering the soul who dreamed wildly. Remembering the intuition you silenced to fit in. Remembering the voice inside you that whispered, "Something is wrong," long before the shattering ever began. Now, that voice becomes your anchor. You start making decisions from alignment, not fear. You start choosing what feels true, not what looks impressive. You start saying no, without guilt, and yes, without self-betrayal. You start honoring your boundaries as sacred. You start listening to your body as if it were a temple, because it is. You start treating your soul as if it were alive, because it always was. Rebirth is not instant. It is not dramatic. It is steady, grounded, and deeply personal. Some days you feel illuminated. Some days you feel lost again. Some days you feel strong. Some days you feel fragile. This is normal. Rebirth is not a linear ascent. It is a spiral. Each cycle brings you deeper, closer to truth, closer to essence, closer to the self. You start re-entering the world, not as the person you were, but as someone who moves differently. You no longer chase meaning. You embody it. You no longer cling to relationships. You attract what resonates. You no longer beg for clarity. You trust your inner knowing. You no longer fear solitude. You cherish it as nourishment. You no longer perform your identity. You inhabit it quietly, naturally, without effort. The world may not understand this new version of you, and that's okay. Rebirth isn't for the world. It's for you. As you rise from the ashes of your old life, you feel a new kind of strength. Not the strength of armor, but the strength of authenticity. Not the strength of perfection, but the strength of presence. Not the strength of ego, but the strength of soul. This strength is soft, but unwavering. Quiet, but unshakable. Gentle, but undeniable. You begin to realize the journey wasn't about becoming someone better. It was about becoming someone true. And now, as this truth settles into your bones, as your soul reclaims its place at the center of your life, a new stage begins. One the world rarely sees, because it is not performed, it is lived. This stage is embodiment, the final stage of awakening, where your truth is no longer an idea, but a way of being. Rebirth is the moment you remember who you are. Embodiment is the moment you begin to live from that remembrance. Most people think awakening ends with insight, with understanding, with clarity, with higher consciousness. But true awakening doesn't happen in the mind. It happens in the body, in how you move through the world, in how you speak, choose, love, walk, breathe. Embodiment is not a thought. It is a frequency. It is the moment your inner transformation becomes your outer reality, not through force, but through presence. This presence is unlike anything you've known before. It's quiet, but powerful, soft, but unmovable, invisible, but unmistakably felt. Carl Jung said that the goal of individuation is not perfection, but wholeness. Embodiment is wholeness made visible. You're no longer trying to appear awakened. You are awakened, and you no longer need to prove it. You no longer perform kindness to be liked. You express compassion because it is natural. You no longer suppress your boundaries to avoid conflict. You honor your truth, even when your voice trembles. You no longer chase relationships that mirror your wounds. You choose connections that resonate with your soul. You no longer cling to the past. You allow it to rest. You no longer fight your emotions. You feel them without drowning in them. You no longer shapeshift for approval. You stand as you are. This is embodiment, living your truth without apology. And the world feels it. People look at you and sense something they cannot name. A steadiness, a depth, a presence that reflects their unconscious back to them. Some will be drawn to it because your presence awakens something ancient within them. Others will feel threatened because your clarity exposes their illusions. But you do not dim yourself anymore. You do not shrink to fit old spaces. You do not silence your intuition. You no longer negotiate your worth, because embodiment gives you something the false self never could. A center, a place inside you that cannot be shaken by opinion, rejection, or misunderstanding. You walk differently, not faster, not slower, but with intention, with groundedness, with the quiet confidence of someone who has seen themselves in the fire and chosen truth over comfort. Embodiment changes how you love. You stop clinging. You stop chasing. You stop begging for reciprocity. Your love becomes clean, not born from need, but from fullness. You no longer love people for what they give you. You love them because loving is your nature, and you let them go when they cannot meet you. Not from bitterness, but from clarity. Embodiment changes your creativity. You don't create to impress. You create because inspiration moves through you. You don't force ideas. You allow them to arrive. You don't fear starting over. You trust your inner rhythm. Embodiment changes your spirituality. You no longer chase experiences, visions, signs, synchronicities. You live in alignment with the deeper knowing behind them. You stop using spirituality as a coping mechanism and begin living it as a truth. Embodiment is not loud. It's not performative. It's not dramatic. It's not glamorous. Sometimes it looks like choosing stillness. Sometimes it looks like walking away. Sometimes it looks like crying in silence. Sometimes it looks like saying no, softly. Sometimes it looks like smiling at a truth only you understand. It is subtle, deliberate, honest, sacred, and this sacredness becomes your strength. The world can no longer pull you back into who you were. Fear can no longer hijack your choices. Shame can no longer control your behavior. External noise cannot drown your inner knowing. You have become sovereign, not above others, but above your old self, above your old patterns, above the illusions that once imprisoned you. You do not rise by climbing. You rise by remembering, by aligning, by staying awake when the world asks you to sleep, by honoring the truth even when it costs you the life you built. And now, finally, you walk through the world, not as the seeker, but as the embodiment of everything you sought. You carry a light, not meant to impress, but to illuminate, not meant to save others, but to guide those who are ready, not meant to shine outward, but to shine through you. Embodiment is the quiet revolution. No resistance, no performance, no fight, just truth lived fully. And when you live your truth, you give others permission to find theirs. This quiet, steady, unshakable presence is why you survived your spiritual awakening, because you didn't give up in the shattering. You didn't retreat in the exile. You didn't numb in the cocoon. You didn't run from the shadow. You didn't fear the void. You didn't resist the rebirth. You stayed. And now, you are becoming what you were always meant to be, someone real, someone awake, someone whole. If you've made it here, if you've listened through every stage, the shattering, the ego death, the exile, the cocoon, the shadow, the void, the rebirth, the embodiment, then hear this clearly. Most people never reach this point, not because they're weak, not because they're unworthy, but because they turn back the moment the path becomes dark, the moment the old self begins to crumble, the moment the truth asks for more than their comfort can give. But you stayed. You stayed through the breaking. You stayed through the silence. You stayed through the nights when you questioned everything. You stayed through the discomfort, the grief, the emptiness. You stayed even when you didn't know who you were becoming. You stayed in the fire long enough for the fire to become your teacher. This is what Carl Jung meant when he said that only a few souls ever truly come to know themselves, because knowing yourself is not about insight, it's about endurance. It's about staying when every part of you wants to run. It's about trusting the process without seeing the destination. And now, after all of it, you stand on the other side, not polished, not perfect, not enlightened in the way the world romanticizes, but real in your presence, real in your boundaries, real in your truth, real in your humanity. You no longer need the world's permission to exist. You no longer need applause to feel worthy. You no longer need validation to know who you are, because you've met yourself in the silence beneath everything you ever feared. So as you leave this video, take this final truth with you. You are not healing to become someone else. You are healing to come home to the self you abandoned long ago. And now that you've begun to return, the world will feel different, quieter, truer, more aligned, more alive. This journey is not finished. It's only beginning. Awakening isn't a destination. It's a way of walking through life with your eyes open and your soul unmasked. If this video spoke to a part of you that words can't reach, if it held up a mirror to something you've been afraid to face, if it reminded you that you're not losing your mind, you're finding your soul, then don't walk this path alone. Subscribe to the channel, because here we go deeper. Here we explore Jung's hidden teachings. Here we unravel the shadow, the unconscious, the inner world you were never taught to navigate. Here you'll find the language for feelings you've never been able to explain. Here you'll find the guidance for a journey most people misunderstand. And if this video resonated, leave a comment below with a simple phrase. I'm staying, not for the world, not for the ego, but for yourself, for the soul that's been waiting decades for you to finally say those words. You survived your spiritual awakening, and now you're ready to live as the awakened.